There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock softly, wearing the plain clothes of a Tuesday night or a simple question, and you don't realize until much later that they were the hinges upon which your entire world was about to swing open. For me, that moment was the sound of his socked feet on the hardwood floor of my hallway, a hesitant shuffling that stopped just outside my bedroom door. It was a sound I had been hearing for weeks, a prelude to a ritual that had become the new, terrifying, and beautiful center of my gravity. He didn't knock. He never did. He just stood there, a silhouette framed by the dim light of the living room, waiting for me to acknowledge the space he was occupying, a space that was neither inside nor out. He was waiting for permission to cross a threshold he had already breached a dozen times before, but whose significance we had both silently agreed to ignore. Ethan. His voice was quiet, frayed at the edges, the way it always was on these nights. I was in bed, propped up against the pillows with a book I hadn't been reading, its pages a blur of black ink I couldn't decipher. The lamp on my nightstand cast a small, warm pool of light, creating a sanctuary that felt a world away from the darkness where he stood. I had been listening for him, of course. Ever since his car had pulled into the spot out front, my entire nervous system had been tuned to the frequency of his arrival. The soft thud of the car door, the jingle of keys, the click of my apartment lock he now knew as well as his own. I had become an unwilling expert in the geography of his grief, a cartographer of his sadness. I lowered the book to my lap. "Yeah, Liam. I'm here." He took a half step into the room, just enough for the light to catch the weariness on his face. He was still in the clothes he'd worn to work, a button-down shirt, rumpled now, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked lost, like a traveler who had followed a map to its end only to find nothing there. It was an expression I had come to know intimately over the past 2 months. It was the face of a man whose future had been abruptly and violently rewritten by someone else. "The couch is," he trailed off, searching for a word he didn't have. "It's just really big tonight." It was our code. It was the gentle fiction we had constructed to make this possible. The couch wasn't too big, the apartment was too empty. His own bed, in his own apartment across town, was a ghost ship he couldn't bear to board. So he came here. He came to me. And every night for the past few weeks, after a few hours of pretending to watch a movie or just sitting in shared silence, he would eventually find his way to my door and confess the vastness of my living room furniture. It was a lie, but it was a kind one. It was the excuse we both needed to let him take the few remaining steps into my room, to let him slide under the covers on the far side of my bed, and to let us lie there in the dark, separated by a chasm of unspoken things, breathing in unison until sleep finally took him. It was a madness I had willingly invited into my home, a beautiful, exquisite torture that I both craved and dreaded. Because with his back to me, with the warmth of his body radiating across the small distance between us, I could almost pretend this was something else. I could almost forget that I was just the safe harbor, the temporary port in his storm. I could almost forget that my feelings for him were a secret I had been keeping for years, a delicate glass object I held so carefully that my own hands had started to ache from the strain. That night, watching him in the doorway, a profound sense of inevitability washed over me. It felt different. The air was heavier, charged with more than just his sadness and my silence. It felt like the final page of a long chapter, and I was terrified of what would be written on the next. I folded the corner of the page in my book, a dog ear on a moment I knew I would need to find again, and I lifted the edge of my duvet in a silent invitation. He didn't need the lie tonight. We both knew why he was here. He crossed the room, the floorboards sighing under his weight, and for the first time, I felt the terrifying, thrilling certainty that the door he had just walked through was not the one to my bedroom, but to my life, and that once he closed it behind him, it might never open the same way again. I met Liam through his older brother, Mark. It was the kind of incidental, unremarkable beginning that belies the significance of the story that follows. Mark and I were on the same university rowing team, a collection of lanky, sleep-deprived young men who found a strange camaraderie in punishing our bodies at 5 in the morning on the cold, misty surface of the river. Mark was loud, affable, and uncomplicated. He was the sun, and I, a quiet photographer who preferred the shadows and the periphery, was a planet in a distant orbit. We were friends in the way that teammates are friends, bound by a shared experience, but not necessarily by a deep, intrinsic connection. He knew me as the guy who was always taking pictures, documenting the grimaces of exertion and the rare, fleeting moments of grace on the water. I was the team's unofficial archivist, more comfortable behind a lens than in the center of any conversation. Liam was a ghost story for the first year I knew Mark. He was my little brother, the brilliant one, the one who was acing his computer science degree at a more prestigious university a few states away. He was a myth, a collection of anecdotes Mark would share over post-practice breakfasts. Liam, the coding genius. Liam, the one who could talk his way into or out of anything. Liam, who had a serious girlfriend he'd been with since high school. He was a fully formed character in a novel I had no part in, and I felt no particular pull toward him. He was just a name, a phantom sibling. Then, one summer, the phantom materialized. Mark had organized a barbecue at his parents' house, a sprawling, comfortable home in the suburbs, and the whole team was invited. I went, as I usually did to these things, with my camera as my shield, my social passport. It gave me a reason to be present but detached, to observe without having to fully participate. I was taking a picture of the light filtering through the leaves of a massive oak tree in the backyard when a voice beside me said, "You're trying to capture the bouquet." I lowered my camera, startled. Standing there was a younger, leaner version of Mark, but where Mark's features were broad and open, this young man's were sharper, more defined. He had the same easy smile, but his eyes were different. They were a deep, startling blue, and they held an intensity, a focused intelligence that Mark's friendly brown eyes lacked. He was watching me not with idle curiosity, but with genuine interest. "It's good," he continued, nodding toward my camera. "The light's perfect for it right now. You'll get those nice, soft orbs in the background." I was taken aback. Most people, especially the jocks on our team, saw my camera as a quirky hobby. They'd ask me to take a picture of them, but no one ever asked me what I was trying to capture in the picture. "You know photography?" I asked, my voice sounding rusty from disuse. "A little," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Liam, Mark's brother." Of course he was. The myth made flesh. We shook hands, and his grip was firm, confident. "Ethan," I said. "I know. You're the camera guy. Mark talks about you," he smiled, and the intensity in his eyes softened, replaced by a warmth that was disarmingly familiar, yet entirely new. "He says you make us all look more heroic than we actually are." That was the beginning. It was simple. We talked for nearly an hour that afternoon, huddled away from the boisterous center of the party, discussing lenses and light, composition, and the strange magic of freezing a moment in time. He told me about an elective he'd taken, a black and white film photography class, and the frustrating, beautiful process of working in a darkroom. He spoke of it with the same passion he apparently applied to his coding, as a system of logic and creativity, a puzzle to be solved. I found myself listening, truly listening, in a way I rarely did. I was usually the one observing, but with Liam, I felt seen. He wasn't just talking at me. He was engaging with a part of me that usually remained hidden behind the camera. From that day on, Liam became a recurring character in my life. Whenever he was in town visiting Mark, we'd make a point to connect. Sometimes it was just the three of us grabbing a beer, but more often than not, Mark would get bored with our nerd talk about f-stops and shutter speeds and wander off, leaving Liam and me to fall into our own comfortable rhythm. Our friendship was built in a separate room from the one I shared with Mark. It had different furniture, a different quality of light. It was a quieter, more intimate space. It was during one of those early conversations that I began to feel it, a subtle, unnerving shift in my own internal landscape. It wasn't a sudden earthquake, but a slow, tectonic drift. I was watching him explain some complex algorithm, his hands sketching invisible diagrams in the air, his blue eyes bright with enthusiasm, and I was struck by a thought that was so clear and unwelcome it felt like a physical impact. He is beautiful. It wasn't just a physical observation. It was a sudden, holistic appreciation for the entire person, the quickness of his mind, the easy confidence of his posture, the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across his forehead when he was concentrating. I pushed the thought away, burying it deep. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, a woman I had met a few times and who was perfectly lovely. They were a unit, a known quantity. And I was, me, the quiet observer, the friend. To feel anything more was a complication I couldn't afford. It was a violation of the unspoken terms of our friendship. So I became a master of emotional containment. I built walls within myself, carefully plastered and painted to look like simple, platonic affection. My feelings for him became my own private darkroom, a place where I could develop the images of him I collected. The way he laughed, the sound of his voice, the look in his eyes when he solved a problem, without ever letting them see the light of day. Over the next few years, our friendship deepened. He graduated and took a high-pressure job as a software consultant, which meant he traveled constantly. My apartment, which was conveniently located near the airport, became his unofficial base camp. He'd crash on my couch for a night or two between trips, leaving a duffel bag and the scent of his laundry detergent in his wake. Our lives were disparate. His, a whirlwind of airports and corporate clients. Mine, a slow, deliberate process of building a freelance photography career. But we remained a fixed point for each other. I was the calm he returned to, and he was the jolt of energy that occasionally disrupted my quiet life. He would call me from hotel rooms in cities I'd never been to, describing the view from his window or complaining about a difficult client. And I would listen, offering what little advice I could, but mostly just offering my presence, a steady voice across the miles. During these calls, I would sometimes close my eyes and picture him there, alone in a sterile room, and the ache of my hidden affection would be a dull, constant pressure behind my ribs. I wanted to be more than a voice on the phone. I wanted to be the person he came home to, not just the person whose couch he borrowed. But I never said a word. The friendship was too precious to risk. It was a rare and beautiful thing, this connection we had, and the thought of shattering it with the clumsy weight of my own desires was unbearable. So I watched from behind my self-imposed fortifications. I listened, and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I just knew that the role I had been assigned was the friend, and I played it to perfection, all the while nursing a secret, impossible hope that one day, the script might change. I had no idea that the change would come not as a gentle revision, but as a catastrophic plot twist that would tear his world apart, and, in doing so, force open the door to mine. The shift began with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon in October. It was a cold, gray day, the kind that leaches the color from the world, and I was in my small home office, editing a series of architectural photos I had taken for a client. The work was precise, meticulous, and calming. I was adjusting the contrast on a shot of a concrete facade when my phone buzzed, displaying Liam's name. I smiled, expecting a call from a layover in Chicago or a complaint about the hotel Wi-Fi in Dallas. "Hey man, where in the world are you today?" I answered, leaning back in my chair. Silence. Not the usual crackle of a bad connection, but a heavy, weighted silence. I could hear his breathing, shallow and uneven. "Liam," I said, sitting up straight. "You there?" She left me. The 3 words were delivered in a monotone, stripped of all emotion, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. They were so alien coming from his voice, which was usually so full of energy and confidence. "What? Who? Sarah?" The questions tumbled out, stupid and obvious. Of course, Sarah. They had been together for 8 years. They were a fixture, a landmark in the landscape of our lives. They were supposed to get married, have 25 kids, a dog, a house in a suburb just like the one his parents lived in. It was the plan. Liam was a man who lived by plans, by logical progressions. "Yeah," he finally whispered, and the whisper cracked. I came home from the trip to Seattle. She was just gone. Most of her stuff was gone. There was a letter on the kitchen table. My own room suddenly felt cold. I swiveled in my chair and looked out the window at the bleak, colorless sky. What? What did it say? I asked, feeling like an intruder in the most private and painful moment of his life. The usual, I guess, he said, his voice thick with a bitterness I'd never heard before. I love you, but I'm not in love with you. I need to find myself. This isn't fair to either of us anymore. A bunch of cliches that all mean the same thing. It's over, he took a shaky breath. 8 years, Ethan. She ended 8 years in a 2-page letter. I didn't know what to say. The usual platitudes felt hollow and insulting. I'm sorry was inadequate. You'll be okay was a lie. So I said the only true thing I could think of. Where are you right now? I'm in my car. I've just been driving. I drove past the apartment. I can't go in there. All her ghosts are in there. His voice was unraveling. The carefully constructed confidence of Liam, the problem solver, disintegrating into the raw pain of a man who had just had his foundation ripped out from under him. I don't know where to go. Come here, I said, without a moment of hesitation. The words were out before I had even fully formed the thought. Just come to my place. I don't want to be a bother, he mumbled, a pathetic echo of his usual polite self. Liam, shut up, I said, my voice softer than the words themselves. You're not a bother. Just drive here. I'll buzz you in. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking like a shipwreck survivor. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He was holding the letter in his hand, the pages crumpled into a ball. He walked into my apartment and just stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he'd never seen it before. He was adrift, and my small, quiet space was the only piece of solid ground he could find. He didn't speak. He just walked over to me and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. It was not a casual, friendly hug. It was a desperate, clinging embrace, the hug of a drowning man. I was frozen for a second, shocked by the sudden, raw physicality of it. Then I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly. I could feel the tremors running through his body, the raggedness of his breathing against my neck. He wasn't crying, not yet. He was just holding on. And in that moment, all the carefully constructed walls I had built around my feelings for him crumbled to dust. There was no room for my own secret desires, no space for my own complex emotions. There was only him, and his overwhelming, suffocating pain. My role had changed in an instant. I was no longer just the friend. I was the anchor. That night was the beginning of the ritual. He stayed, of course. He collapsed onto my couch, and I covered him with a blanket. I made him tea that he didn't drink. We didn't talk much. I just sat in the armchair across from him, reading my book, or pretending to, while he stared at the blank television screen. The silence in the room was thick with everything he couldn't say. I was giving him the only thing I could, the simple, uncomplicated presence of another human being, a witness to his pain who demanded nothing in return. Around midnight, his eyes finally fluttered shut, his body surrendering to an exhaustion that was more than just physical. I watched him sleep for a long time. His face, usually so animated and confident, was slack with vulnerability. The strong, capable Liam I knew had been replaced by this broken, sleeping stranger on my couch. A fierce, protective instinct rose in me, so powerful it startled me. It was a feeling that went beyond friendship, beyond the secret crush I had harbored for years. It was deeper, more fundamental. It was the desire to shield him from the world, to absorb his pain into myself if it would lessen his burden. That was the first night. He went back to his apartment the next day to pack up the rest of her things, a grim, methodical task that he performed with the detached efficiency of a consultant wrapping up a failed project. But he couldn't stay there. The space was haunted by the ghost of a future that would never happen. So he came back to my couch. And the night after that, the couch became his bed. My apartment became his sanctuary. The catalyst had struck, and the slow, inexorable shift in our dynamic had begun. He was seeking a comfort from me that he had never needed before, and in his desperation, he began to erase the carefully drawn lines of our friendship, unaware that he was stepping into a territory I had secretly mapped out in my heart years ago. He was walking toward me, finally, but he was doing it with his eyes closed, Driven by a pain I would have done anything to take away, even as I selfishly hoped it might, somehow, lead him to me. The ritual began on the couch. For the first week, it was an unspoken arrangement. He would show up after work, his face a mask of tired resignation. We would eat takeout, sitting on the floor around my coffee table, because he couldn't bear the formality of a dining table built for two. He was a ghost at a feast of his own misery, and I was his silent companion. Then we would migrate to the living room, where I would put on a movie, something loud and stupid, an action movie or a dumb comedy, anything to fill the space and demand nothing from him. He would lie down on the sofa, his head propped on a cushion, and within 20 minutes, his breathing would deepen, his body finally letting go of the tension he carried all day. I would watch the flicker of the screen reflect in his closed eyelids, and I would feel a profound, aching tenderness. I would let the movie play to its end, the sound a low hum in the quiet apartment. Then I would turn everything off, drape a thick wool blanket over him, and retreat to my own room. I would lie in my bed, separated from him by only a thin wall, and I would listen. I'd listen for the sound of him stirring, for a sigh, for any sign of the nightmares I knew must be plaguing him. The wall between our rooms felt like a membrane, porous and thin. His sadness seemed to seep through it, filling my own space with a quiet melancholy. I fell asleep each night to the rhythm of his breathing, a faint, reassuring cadence in the dark. This went on for nearly 3 weeks. The couch was his. He kept a change of clothes and a toothbrush in my bathroom. My apartment, once my solitary fortress of quiet, had become a shared space, our space. I learned the patterns of his grief. I learned that he was quietest in the mornings, the reality of his new life crashing down on him with the first light of day. I learned that he needed the distraction of work, the logic and order of code, to get through the hours until he could return to the safety of my living room. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight tightening of his jaw that meant he was thinking about her, the distant look in his eyes that meant he was replaying their last conversation. I became a scholar of his sorrow. And through it all, I was meticulously careful. I maintained a physical distance. I kept my hands to myself. My comfort was verbal, my support atmospheric. I was terrified of making a wrong move, of misinterpreting his need for comfort as an opening for my own buried feelings. To do so would be predatory, a grotesque manipulation of his vulnerability. So I policed myself with a ruthless vigilance. I was the perfect friend, the steady, unwavering support system. My own heart was a silent, frantic engine beneath a calm surface. The proximity to him, the domesticity of it all, making coffee in the morning, the sight of his shoes by my door, was a slow, sweet poison. It was everything I had ever wanted, but it was born of his pain, and that tainted everything with a bittersweet guilt. Then, one night, the ritual changed. It was a Thursday. He had a terrible day at work. A project had gone sideways, and the stress had cracked the fragile composure he had been maintaining. He arrived at my door looking utterly depleted, as if the strings holding him together had finally snapped. He barely spoke during dinner, just pushed food around his plate. We didn't even make it to the movie. He just collapsed onto the couch, curled into a tight ball, and was asleep in minutes. I did my usual routine. I waited. I covered him with the blanket. I turned off the lights. But as I stood there in the dark, looking down at his shape on my sofa, a wave of profound inadequacy washed over me. The blanket seemed too thin, the couch too exposed. The living room, which had been a sanctuary, suddenly felt vast and cold. He looked so small and alone. My careful, platonic distance felt less like respect and more like a form of abandonment. I went to my room, but I couldn't settle. The silence from the other room was different tonight. It wasn't peaceful, it was desolate. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any sound. An hour passed, then another. It was well after 1 in the morning when I heard it, the soft creak of the couch, followed by the whisper of socked feet on the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that he was coming to my door. And there he was. The silhouette in the doorway, the moment I would later recognize as the hinge. He stood there for a long time before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was a raw, broken thing. "Ethan, I'm here. The couch is. It's just really big tonight." There it was. The lie. The gentle fiction. But tonight, I understood its true meaning. He wasn't talking about the furniture. He was talking about the loneliness. It was a chasm, and he was afraid of falling in. My own voice was steady, betraying none of the chaos inside me. "I know." I lifted the duvet. An invitation. A crossing of a line I had sworn to myself I would never approach. He hesitated for only a second before moving into the room. He didn't turn on a light. He just navigated by the faint glow from the street lamp outside my window. He walked around to the far side of the bed, the side by the wall, and slipped under the covers, his movements slow and deliberate. He was fully clothed, still in his rumpled work shirt and trousers. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, as rigid as a statue. The space between us was a foot of empty sheet, but it felt like a high-voltage wire. The air was thick with unspoken rules, with questions we were both afraid to ask. Was this okay? What did this mean? Is this just for tonight? I lay there, equally rigid, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a warmth that my own skin craved with a desperate, cellular hunger. I focused on my breathing, trying to make it slow and even, terrified that he would hear the wild, frantic beating of my heart. After what felt like an eternity of charged silence, he let out a long, shuddering sigh. The tension seemed to drain out of him all at once. His shoulders slumped. He turned onto his side, his back facing me. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness, the words barely audible. "It's okay," I whispered back. "Go to sleep." And he did. Within minutes, his breathing settled into the slow, deep rhythm of sleep. He was exhausted. His body and mind finally granted a reprieve from the lonely vigil of his grief. But for me, sleep was an impossibility. I was more awake than I had ever been in my life. I was lying next to Liam. He was in my bed. The reality of it was both a dream come true and a nightmare of restraint. Every nerve ending in my body was aware of him. The scent of his skin, a faint, clean scent mixed with the day's fatigue. The subtle weight of his body on the mattress. The sound of his breath, a soft puff of air with every exhale. This became the new ritual. The couch was abandoned. My bed became our shared space. It was never discussed. He would come over. We would go through the motions of our evening, and then, at some point, he would quietly excuse himself and go to my room, and I would follow a little while later. We were like two shy, orbiting planets who had found a strange, temporary alignment. He always took the side by the wall, and he always faced away from me. It was his way of maintaining a boundary, of reinforcing the fiction that this was purely about proximity, not intimacy. It was a platonic arrangement that just happened to take place in a bed. For me, those nights were a study in exquisite torture. I would lie awake for hours, my body screaming with the need to reach out, to lay a hand on his back, to offer a comfort that was more than just my passive presence. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was the guardian of this fragile truce, and the first rule was, do not touch. To touch him would be to admit that this was something more, to shatter the plausible deniability that allowed him to be here in the first place. So I lay perfectly still, a sentinel in the dark, my love for him a silent, watchful thing. I would watch the moonlight trace the line of his shoulder, the curve of his neck. I would memorize the shape of him under the blankets. My darkroom was no longer just in my mind. It was here, in the quiet of my bedroom, where I developed these secret, nocturnal images of him, printing them onto my memory with an indelible, aching clarity. This ritual, born of his sorrow, was becoming the most profound and painful joy of my life, and I had no idea how it could possibly end. The ritual continued for 6 weeks. 63 nights of him in my apartment, 42 of them in my bed. The initial, unbearable tension had settled into a strange kind of normal. The space between us and the bed, once a screaming chasm, had become a quiet, understood boundary. It was a territory of mutual respect. He needed a place to feel safe without being encroached upon, and I needed to provide that safety without betraying the storm of my own feelings. We were co-conspirators in a silent agreement, the terms of which were never spoken aloud. The arrangement was a fragile ecosystem, and I was its devoted, anxious caretaker. I learned to sleep again. Though it was a lighter sleep than I was used to, my subconscious always attuned to his presence, to the rhythm of his breathing. I would wake up in the morning to find his side of the bed empty, a faint warmth and the impression of his head on the pillow the only evidence he had been there at all. He was always up first, already in the kitchen making coffee, the ghost of the night replaced by the reliable presence of my friend. Our morning conversations were a study in normalcy. We'd talk about work, about the news, about a funny video I'd seen online. We never, ever mentioned the fact that we had just spent 8 hours lying inches apart in the dark. It was a shared secret we kept even from each other. The nights were a separate reality, a pocket universe governed by different laws. And in the daylight, we would pretend that universe didn't exist. This duality was exhausting. I felt like I was living two lives, the daytime life of Ethan, the supportive friend, and the nighttime life of Ethan, the silent, yearning lover. The strain of keeping them separate was beginning to wear me down. My meticulously constructed walls were showing cracks. The change, when it came, was as quiet and subtle as everything else between us. It was a Saturday night. We had spent the day in a comfortable, domestic silence. I worked on editing photos in my office while he sat on the living room floor, meticulously sorting through a box of financial documents, dismantling the last administrative ties to his old life. The task was grim, but he was methodical, focused. For the first time in weeks, he seemed less like a man drowning and more like a man learning to tread water. There was a resolve in his posture that hadn't been there before. That evening, we ordered pizza and watched a documentary about deep-sea exploration. As the credits rolled, he didn't immediately get up and retreat to the bedroom as he usually did. He just sat there on the floor, leaning against the sofa, watching the screen go black. "It's incredible, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft. "That whole world down there, in complete darkness. Functioning. Living. With all that pressure." "Yeah," I said from the armchair. "They adapt. They have to." He turned his head and looked at me, his blue eyes reflective in the dim light from the television's standby button. "Do you think people can do that? Adapt to that much pressure? To living in the dark?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. He wasn't talking about fish. I knew it. He knew I knew it. It was the closest we had ever come to acknowledging the reality of our situation. "I think they can," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I think sometimes the darkness is where you learn how to see." He held my gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between us. Then he nodded slowly, as if I had just confirmed something he had been wondering about. He stood up, stretched, and then, instead of his usual good night, he just said, "I'm heading to bed." A simple, domestic statement that implied a shared space, a shared life. It was a subtle shift in language, but it felt monumental. I followed a few minutes later, my heart beating a little faster than usual. The air in the bedroom felt different. It was still, but it wasn't the tense stillness of our first few nights. It was a watchful, expectant stillness. I got into my side of the bed. He was already there, lying on his back this time, not his side. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. I lay on my back, too, mirroring his posture. We were two soldiers in a trench, staring up at the same dark sky. For a long time, the only sound was our synchronized breathing. The ritual was about to be broken. I could feel it, the way you can feel the drop in barometric pressure before a storm. The fragile ecosystem was about to collapse or evolve into something new. Then, he turned his head on the pillow, and he looked at me. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could see the conflict in his eyes. The fear, the uncertainty, but something else, too. A question. A plea. He whispered my name. "Ethan." It was not the broken, frayed whisper from the hallway weeks ago. This was different. It was solid. It was intentional. I turned my head to face him. We were inches apart now, the last vestiges of our carefully maintained distance erased by a simple turn of the head. I could see every detail of his face, the faint stubble on his jaw, the slight parting of his lips, the intense, searching look in his eyes. My entire world narrowed to the space between our faces. He didn't move. He just watched me, his gaze holding mine. He was giving me a choice. He was giving me an out. I could turn away, retreat to the safety of our established boundary, and we would never speak of this again. The door would close, and the ritual would continue, unchanged. Or I could stay. I could hold his gaze. I could meet his vulnerability with my own. I stayed. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stayed there, my eyes locked with his, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. In that silence, I was laying down all my defenses. I was showing him the truth I had hidden for so long, not in words, but in the simple, terrifying act of not looking away. A lifetime seemed to pass in that silent, charged moment. Then, his voice, a raw, fragile whisper, broke the stillness. Would it be okay? Just 3 words. Not, can I kiss you? Not a statement of intent. A question. A request for permission. It was a question steeped in respect, in fear, in a profound, desperate need for consent. He was asking me if it was okay to shatter the world we had so carefully built. He was asking me if I was willing to step into a new one with him, a world without fictions, without plausible deniability. I couldn't find my voice. The words were trapped in my throat, a knot of fear and hope so tight I couldn't speak. So I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but in the charged stillness of the room, it felt like a seismic event. That was all the answer he needed. He moved with an infinite, agonizing slowness. He lifted his head slightly from the pillow, his eyes never leaving mine, and he closed the final distance between us. His lips met mine with a tentative, searching pressure. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of confession. It was soft and hesitant and breathtakingly gentle. It was the taste of salt from unshed tears, the warmth of his breath, the overwhelming, shattering relief of arrival. It was the feeling of a man who had been lost at sea for months finally touching shore. In that moment, everything fell away. The years of secret yearning, the agony of restraint, the fear of ruining everything. It all dissolved into the simple, profound reality of his mouth on mine. I lifted a hand, my fingers trembling, and cupped the side of his face, my thumb stroking his jaw. A small, shuddering breath escaped him, a sound of surrender, and he deepened the kiss, just slightly, a silent confirmation that this was real, that we were both here, that this was happening. It was the quietest, most cataclysmic moment of my life. The line had been crossed. The ritual was broken. And in the beautiful, terrifying wreckage, something new was beginning to be born. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the comfortable, unspoken understanding of our ritual, nor the charged, expectant stillness of the night before. It was a brittle, anxious silence, thin as ice over deep water. I woke up slowly, drifting into consciousness with the ghost of his lips still on mine. The first thing I was aware of was the emptiness beside me. The warmth was gone. The indentation on the pillow was already cool. I opened my eyes, and the gray morning light confirmed it. He was gone. Not just from the bed, but from the apartment. I sat up, my heart a cold stone in my chest. His shoes were gone from their place by the door. The coffee maker was cold. The mug he used every morning was clean and dry in the dish rack. He had vanished, leaving behind no trace except for the faint, lingering scent of his skin on my pillowcase and the chaotic, roaring confusion in my own mind. He had run. My first reaction was a tidal wave of self-recrimination. I had misread everything. I had been a fool. The kiss wasn't a confession. It was a moment of weakness, an aberration born of his grief and loneliness. He had woken up this morning, horrified by what he had done, and fled. I had taken advantage of his vulnerability, even if I hadn't meant to. I had pushed him, even by just nodding. I had broken our fragile truce, and in doing so, I had shattered our friendship. The beautiful, exquisite torture of our ritual was gone, replaced by this ugly, sickening ache of regret. I had been given something precious and fragile, and I had dropped it. I sent him a text message around 10 o'clock, trying to sound casual, breezy, normal. "Hey, you took off early. Everything okay?" The three little dots appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared for what felt like an eternity. Finally, a reply came through, a single, sterile sentence. "Yeah, fine. Just had an early start. Sorry, sorry." The word was a slap. Sorry for what? For leaving? For the kiss? For existing? The ambiguity was a special kind of cruelty. It gave me nothing to hold on to, no clue as to what was happening inside his head. I tried to call him, but it went straight to voicemail. The day stretched on, an eternity of silence and speculation. I paced my apartment, which suddenly felt enormous and empty again, the ghost of his presence now a taunting reminder of what I had lost. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for a clue I might have missed. Had he pulled away first? Had there been regret in his eyes afterward? But all I could remember was the softness of his lips, the tremor in his hand when he finally reached for me, the profound sense of rightness that had filled me. It felt impossible that something that had felt so real, so mutual, could be a mistake. The withdrawal lasted for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hell. His texts were sporadic, brief, and purely functional. He made excuses. He was slammed with work. He had to catch up on life admin. He was staying at his place for a bit, trying to get back to normal. Every excuse was a polite, sterile wall he was building between us. He was retreating, pulling back into the shell of the competent, self-sufficient Liam he had been before the breakup, and he was leaving me on the outside. The pain of it was sharper and more acute than the years of silent yearning had ever been. Before, I had his friendship. Now, I had nothing. I had become a complication he was trying to solve by avoiding. The anger began to smolder beneath the hurt and confusion. Anger at him for his cowardice, for running away without a single word of explanation. And anger at myself for letting this happen, for being so passive for so long, for allowing him to dictate the terms of our relationship from the very beginning. I had been the observer, the quiet harbor, the steady presence. But my passivity had created a space for this ambiguity to fester. My silence had given him permission to be confused, to retreat without consequence. After 14 days of this agonizing distance, I decided I couldn't live in the limbo anymore. The not knowing was worse than any possible truth. If our friendship was truly over, I needed to hear it from him. I needed to see it in his eyes. I needed an ending, not just a fade to black. My fear of confrontation was immense, but my need for clarity was greater. The quiet observer had to finally step into the frame. It was a Wednesday evening. I drove to his apartment, the one he had shared with Sarah, the one he had called a ghost ship. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I had no idea what I was going to say. I just knew I had to go. I parked on the street and walked up to the sterile, impersonal building. I buzzed his apartment number, my heart pounding in my ears. After a long pause, the speaker crackled to life. "Hello." His voice was wary, guarded. "Liam, it's me." Let me in. My own voice was tight, but firm. There was no room for negotiation in it. There was another pause, long enough for me to think he was going to refuse. Then, the sharp, electric buzz of the door unlocking. I took the elevator up to the 4th floor, the slow ascent giving me far too much time to think, to second-guess myself. When the doors opened, he was standing there in his doorway, blocking the entrance. He looked tired, older than he had 2 weeks ago. He was wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Hey," he said, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "Not a great time, Ethan. I'm kind of in the middle of something." "No, you're not," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "You're in the middle of avoiding me. And I'm done with it." I looked past him into the apartment. It was sparse, clinical. The personal touches, Sarah's touches, were all gone. It looked like a hotel room, a temporary space for a man in transit. "Are you going to let me in? Or are we going to have this conversation in the hallway?" He flinched at the word conversation. He sighed, a sound of pure defeat, and stepped aside, letting me pass. I walked into the living room and turned to face him. He closed the door but remained standing by it, as if poised to flee at any moment. The distance between us felt like a mile. "What do you want, Ethan?" he asked, his voice low. "I want the truth," I said, trying to keep my own voice from shaking. "I want to know what happened. I want you to look at me and tell me what the hell is going on. Because for 2 weeks, you have treated me like a stranger, like a mistake you're trying to erase. And I think, after everything, I deserve more than that." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a miserable, cornered panic. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, running a hand through his hair. "I know I've been an ass. I've had a lot on my mind." "Don't," I said, taking a step closer. "Don't you dare hide behind vague excuses. Not with me. Not anymore. Was it a mistake? The kiss? Is that what this is about? If it was, just say it. I'm a big boy. I can take it. But you have to say it to my face." He looked away again, his jaw working. "It was complicated. Complicated," I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. "Right? Because your girlfriend of 8 years leaves you. You fall apart. Your best friend picks up the pieces. You sleep in his bed for 6 weeks, and then you kiss him. Yeah, I can see how that might be classified as complicated, but that's not an answer, Liam. That's an evasion." I took another step. We were only a few feet apart now. I could see the frantic pulse in his neck. "For me," I said, my voice dropping, the anger giving way to a raw, painful vulnerability. "It wasn't complicated. It was the simplest, clearest moment of my entire life. I have been in love with you for years. Years, Liam. While you were with Sarah, while we were just friends, while you were sleeping on my couch. I have been right here, loving you in silence, because I valued your friendship more than my own happiness. And I was okay with that. I was. But then you kissed me. And for 1 second, I let myself believe. I let myself hope that it wasn't just me. My confession hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. I had laid all my cards on the table. I had taken the ultimate risk. Now it was his turn. He stared at me, his face a mask of shock and something else, something I couldn't read. He looked utterly poleaxed. He stumbled back, sinking onto the arm of his sofa as if his legs could no longer support him. You love me?" he whispered, the words sounding foreign and impossible on his tongue. "Yes," I said, the single word holding the weight of half a decade of secret feelings. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Oh God," he groaned. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I'm such an idiot. Stop apologizing," I said, my frustration boiling over. "Just talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what you're feeling." He looked up, and his eyes were shining with unshed tears. The panic was gone, replaced by a look of profound, heartbreaking confusion. "I don't know what I'm feeling," he cried, his voice cracking. "That's the whole problem. When Sarah left, my whole world, my whole future, it just vanished. And you were there. You were so steady, so solid. And being at your place, it was the only time I felt safe. The only time the noise in my head stopped." He took a ragged breath, his gaze locked on mine. "And those nights, lying next to you, it was more than just not being alone. I felt calm, cared for, in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. And I started to need it. I started to need you. And it scared the hell out of me. Because I'm not. I've only ever been with women. With Sarah. It's the only story I know how to be in." He stood up and walked toward me, his movements hesitant, uncertain. "And that night, when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. God, it wasn't. In that moment, it was the only thing in the world that made sense. It felt like coming home. But the next morning, I woke up, and the panic set in. What did I just do? Who am I? I've spent my whole life on this one track, and I just derailed everything. I looked at you, sleeping there, and I was so terrified. Terrified of what I was feeling. Terrified of what it meant. And terrified of hurting you. Because you're the best person I know, Ethan. And the last thing I ever wanted to do was drag you into my mess and break your heart." He was standing in front of me now, his confession a torrent of fear and honesty. "So I ran," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. "I ran because I'm a coward. I ran because I don't know how to feel this. I don't know how to be this person." He looked at me, his blue eyes pleading, desperate for understanding. I'm not sorry I kissed you, he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. I'm sorry I was too scared to stay. And in that moment, all my anger, all my hurt, it just dissolved. All I could see was the man I loved, standing in the ruins of his own life, terrified of the new one that was trying to bloom in its place. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man who had lost his map and was terrified of the new, uncharted territory he had stumbled into. The conflict wasn't over, but the war of silence had ended. We were finally talking. And in the quiet space created by his painful, honest confession, there was, for the first time, a glimmer of hope. His confession hung in the sterile air of his apartment, a fragile, trembling thing. The walls I had built, the anger I had nurtured for 2 weeks, all of it had been dismantled by the raw, unvarnished truth of his fear. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a version of himself he didn't understand. Seeing him so stripped bare, so utterly lost, a profound sense of calm settled over me. The chaos of my own emotions quieted, replaced by a simple, focused clarity. He wasn't a problem to be solved or an enemy to be fought. He was just Liam, and he was scared. I closed the small distance that remained between us, and, without thinking, I reached out and took his hands. They were cold and trembling. I held them firmly in my own, my warmth seeping into his skin. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face, his expression one of bewildered gratitude. You don't have to be this new person overnight, I said, my voice soft. You don't have to have a label for it. You don't have to have it all figured out. You have to stop running. From me. And from yourself. He squeezed my hands, a faint pressure that was both a plea and an agreement. I don't know how, he whispered. Every instinct I have is telling me to build a plan, to find a logical path forward. But there isn't one. This is all just feeling. And it's terrifying. I know, I said. So let's just stay in the feeling for a minute. Let's not try to build a 5-year plan out of it. Let's just be here. Right now, he nodded, a slow, hesitant movement. We stood there for a long time in the middle of his empty living room, holding hands, the silence no longer brittle but full. It was a silence of processing, of absorption. We were letting the truth settle around us, like dust motes in a sunbeam. It was the beginning of a new kind of quiet between us, one based not on avoidance, but on shared vulnerability. Can we go back to your place? He asked eventually, his voice still quiet, but with a thread of steadiness returning to it. I can't. I can't be here tonight. This place isn't home anymore. Of course, I said, my heart giving a hopeful, painful lurch. We drove back to my apartment in my car, in a comfortable silence. It felt different from all the other times he had followed me home. This time, there was no pretext. He wasn't coming to my place because his was haunted or because he was too tired to drive. He was coming to my place because he wanted to be with me. It was a choice, made in the full light of our shared confessions. When we walked into my apartment, it felt like a homecoming for both of us. The space was imbued with a new meaning. It was no longer just my sanctuary or his temporary harbor. It was the place where our story had unfolded, the container for our strange and winding journey toward each other. That night, when we went to bed, everything was different, and yet, nothing was. He still took the side by the wall, a creature of habit. But this time, when he lay down, he turned to face me immediately. The foot of empty space between us remained, but it was no longer a chasm of unspoken things. It was a space of intention, of respect. I can't promise I won't be a mess, he said into the darkness, his eyes finding mine. I can't promise I won't be confused or scared. This is all new territory for me. I'm not asking for promises, I replied, my voice steady. I'm not asking for certainty. I'm just asking you to stay, to not run away when it gets hard. I won't, he said, and the words were a vow. I'm done running. He reached a hand across the space between us, his fingers tentatively brushing against mine. I met his touch, lacing my fingers through his. His hand was still cold, but it was steady now. We lay there like that, face to face, our hands joined in the quiet space between us, and we talked. We talked for hours. He told me about the pressure he had always felt to follow the expected path, the one laid out for him by his family, by society, by Sarah. He talked about his relationship with her, the slow, imperceptible erosion of their connection over the years, a love that had become more of a habit than a feeling. He admitted that his devastation had been less about losing her and more about losing the future he had so meticulously planned, the identity he had built for himself as her partner. And I talked too. I told him about the years of watching him from afar, of cherishing the small moments of our friendship. I described the quiet ache of my secret love, the way I had learned to live with it, to wall it off so it wouldn't damage the precious thing we had. I told him how it felt to have him so close during those weeks, the beautiful, agonizing restraint of it all. We unburdened ourselves in the gentle privacy of the dark, laying our truths out one by one, creating a new, shared history between us. Sometime before dawn, the words finally ran out. We were left in a peaceful, exhausted silence. His thumb was stroking the back of my hand, a slow, rhythmic gesture that was more comforting than any words could be. "Ethan," he whispered. "Yeah." "Would it be okay?" he asked, the same question as before, but this time it held no fear, only a soft, hopeful tenderness. I didn't need to nod this time. I just squeezed his hand and pulled him gently toward me. He came without hesitation, closing the final distance. The kiss was different this time. It wasn't a question or a confession. It was a recognition, a confirmation. It was deep and slow and sure, a kiss that tasted of relief and beginnings. It was the first sentence of our new story, written in the quiet language we had created together. The days that followed were a process of gentle discovery. We were learning a new dance, finding the rhythm of this new relationship. We took it slow, just as we had promised. There were no grand declarations, no immediate need to define what we were to the outside world. Our focus was internal, on the quiet, private space we were building. We were two architects designing a new structure on the foundation of our old friendship. The new normal was made up of small, quiet moments of intimacy. It was him staying over, not out of need, but out of want. It was closing my bedroom door at night, a simple act that signified a new era of intention and privacy. It was waking up in the morning and finding him still there, his arm thrown over my waist, his face peaceful in sleep. It was making coffee together in the morning, our bodies moving around each other in the small kitchen with an easy, familiar grace. It was holding hands while we watched a movie on the couch, the same couch that had once been the site of his lonely exile. He was still scared sometimes. I would see a flicker of the old panic in his eyes, a moment of doubt as he grappled with the tectonic shift in his own identity. But he didn't run. When the fear surfaced, he would talk about it. He would reach for my hand, or just look at me, a silent request for reassurance. And I would give it to him. I learned that my role was not to fix his fear, but to be the steady presence that allowed him to face it. My love was not a cure, but a safe place for him to heal. One Saturday afternoon, about a month after our confrontation, I was in my office, which I had started calling the darkroom again. I was framing a series of black and white prints for a gallery submission. Liam was sitting on the floor, leaning against the doorframe, watching me work. "I finally told Mark," he said quietly. I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. "Oh yeah? How did that go?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "It was fine. Better than fine." I think he was more shocked that it took me so long to figure it out than anything else. He paused, a look of fond exasperation on his face. His exact words were, "Well, duh. The way you two nerd out about cameras? I always figured something was up." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh of relief. So much for my masterful subtlety. "Yeah, well," Liam said, his smile widening. "You were never as good at hiding it as you thought you were. At least, not from him." He grew more serious, his gaze softening. "And I was never as straight as I thought I was. I was just following a script. I think I needed Sarah to leave so I could finally admit the play wasn't working." It was a moment of profound acceptance for both of us. The acknowledgement that the paths we had been on were not necessarily the paths we were meant for. He had needed his world to fall apart to find a truer version of himself. And I had needed to risk everything to finally step out from behind the lens and into the picture. That evening, as we lay in bed, the familiar comfort of our shared space enveloping us, I thought about the nature of home. For so long, I had believed home was a place, my quiet apartment, my fortress of solitude. And for Liam, home had been a plan, a future he was building with someone else. But we were both wrong. We had learned that home wasn't a structure or a blueprint. It was a feeling. It was the profound, unshakable peace of being seen and accepted for exactly who you are. It was the safety of a shared silence, the comfort of a hand to hold in the dark. He was tracing patterns on my arm, his touch a familiar, soothing presence. "What are you thinking about?" he whispered. I turned to look at him, at this man who had stumbled into my life and rearranged its very architecture. I saw the friend I had loved in silence, the broken man I had sheltered, and the partner who was now building a new life with me, one honest conversation at a time. I saw my home. "I was just thinking," I said, leaning in to kiss him, a soft, simple kiss full of quiet certainty, "that the light is perfect right now." We didn't need the grand gestures or the passionate declarations that filled the movies we used to watch. Our love story was quieter, written in the spaces between words, in hesitant touches that became sure, in shared glances across a room, in the steady, reliable rhythm of two people breathing in the dark. It was a love that had been developed slowly, carefully, in the darkroom of our shared grief and tentative hope. And as we lay there, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, I knew, with a peace that settled deep in my bones, that we were finally, truly, home.